Welcome to Exploration Overland. My name is Zach, and today, guys, we're going to talk about, is your gear ready for your next adventure? So stay tuned, guys. Welcome back to the channel. And as I stated before, guys, we are going to talk about, is your gear ready for your next adventure? This isn't a what gear should you have kind of video. It is your gear ready? As in, do you know what to check for on your gear to ensure that it is ready for your next adventure? Because for most people, they have a ton of gear, but they just kind of throw it into their rig and they use it, but they never truly check it at the end of a trip or after several trips. So we're going to go through sort of the basics of what you should be checking for within your gear. Now, as you can see before me, I have a ton of gear on this table, and actually, guys, I have a ton of gear on the ground around this table. That is because I am currently, as I'm doing this video, checking all my gear, because it has been a couple months since I have used my gear, and thus it needs to be checked because I used it all last year, and though I did some minor checks on the things I used all the time, some of the other things that don't get used every time I go out didn't necessarily get checked. And what I like to do before every time I go, or what I like to do after a few months of not being on the trail, is I like going through and inspecting all of my gear to ensure that it is functioning the way it should be functioning. And it also allows me for, if something isn't, I can then order the part that I need to fix it. But out of this massive mess that is on my table, some of these things become a little bit more important than others to check on a regular basis. And certain things such as your kitchen knives that you use for cooking at camp, those type of things, they don't need as much checking as, let's say, your jerry can or your diesel heater that gets used way more frequently and has aspects that over time will start to fail on it. So without further ado, guys, let's start jumping into some of the stuff on the table. All right, so we're going to start with some of the more frequently used things that most people typically use on their adventures, and slowly kind of make our way to the less used things that don't need a bunch of checking. But we're going to start with the diesel heater. For most people nowadays, a diesel heater is what they are using to warm themselves when they are on their adventures, because it's a little more cumbersome, yes, but it runs a lot longer on the diesel than it would on a propane heater. But there are people that still use a propane heater, and you do need to check those too to make sure that they're operating correctly, which I do have an example which we can actually pull out here too. But we're going to start with the diesel heater. And one of the things I love checking on the diesel heater first and foremost is that all the components within and that are electrical, like the screen, are working. So what I like doing is coming in here, checking the tank, checking the heating system, things of that nature. Now, this is an H-calorie diesel heater. Everything for this particular model is enclosed in this case, so it makes it a little harder to like really inspect the heater core or the tank. But from a visual standpoint, you are able to see if there is anything necessarily wrong with it. Things to check for would be the wires, because checking for these wires, if something gets pulled, something seems to be melting, you're going to be able to see it right out the gate from just inspecting these wires. The other thing with the tank that I like checking for is, first off, is the tank being imploded in on itself? Meaning, has something been over the top of the seal, or has the tank not been aerating itself properly, so the tank starts sucking itself in as it is working? Now, that has happened on this diesel heater before. Something actually obstructed this. I had something in here, didn't realize it. It was obstructing this, and the tank started sucking itself in. It did re-expand back out. It will re-expand back out over time, but it's something to check for. Is this, being sucked in whatsoever? The next thing I like to check, like everyone's favorite thing on a diesel heater, is the cap. Normally, the number one thing that's going to go wrong on a diesel heater most of the time is, at least while you're traveling, is the fuel or the diesel inside the tank will slosh around and spill out through either the top of the hole, the seal on the cap, something, but it typically comes out from the cap. So what I like doing is inspecting this, looking at the rubber seal that is in here. You don't want it pinched in spots. You want it to have a nice opening so that you can see that it is actually sealing all the way. Examples of something that would be going bad is if this black rubber seal inside here is starting to look more gray than black, or you're seeing actual crack lines in the rubber. That is a hint that it is dried out or is drying out and is starting to basically break down. It is cracking and it's not actually going to make a seal, and your diesel will start to spill out of the tank as you are going along. And then the other thing I like to just check for is I like to check out on the sides. Now on this, like I said, on some diesel heaters, the tank sits outside. So you are able to check the connection point where the diesel fuel line runs to the tank and then to the system itself. You can check to make sure that that rubber hose, because that's generally what it is in good shape. It's not got cracks in it anywhere, and it is still connected, and the connections are connected. With this, I'm a little more confident, I should say, but I am fairly confident that the rubber hose is okay at the moment, because I can reach down here and I can feel it. It still feels pretty solid, and I have a very reliable feeling that the connection to the tank is in good shape because it's not getting pulled on, because everything is enclosed in here. It's one less thing I kind of worry about. And then the other thing I like to check, as I said, is the screen up here itself. Now generally, if I want to check the screen, I have to plug this in because the screen will not come on otherwise. Easy enough. One of the things though that I do like to check is that all the buttons seem to be functioning. I can press them all without nothing being running, and they actually click. It may not mean that they're working once it's on, but at least they're clicking. It's not like a dead button that no longer works. So I like checking that. I like checking the screen. This has a pretty decent cover, but it is nice to check that there's no water pooled, dried water spots, because water pooled up in here. It's smart to check it out. And then if it comes with a remote, I just click the buttons. I make sure that the battery in the remote is working, because that has actually been kind of useful if I don't have the ability to connect it to my phone. Because sometimes with the Bluetooth system on, at least this thing, it can be a little touchy with connecting. Every once in a while, I've only had it a couple times where it just would not connect that night, so the remote was the way I went. Next, just check your exhaust. Most of the time, nothing's gonna be wrong with the exhaust, but just kind of check it, make sure it looks fairly clean, and that there isn't a ton of carbon buildup on the outside of this. That could be an indicator that there is something possibly wrong with your diesel heater, because it should not be emitting as much smoke. And then finally, before I even turn this on to check it, I inspect the cables. Now these cables that plug into this, they're not the most most expensive cable in the world, so they can fray, they can get snagged, they can get broke. So I like checking the points. I like checking that this will actually still fit into here and connects and has a good connection still. It's not all worn out. And I just like inspecting it. And then what I finally would do is I would plug this in and turn it on and let it run for about 10 minutes. And what that does is, when it allows it to go through its warm-up cycle, and then it will just start running. And I would adjust various heat levels to ensure that it is still working correctly, because during that 10-minute runtime, if something's going to go wrong, it's going to throw an error code out at you. So you're going to know what it is, and that means you can look it up, because the last thing you want is to be out on your adventure needing your diesel heater and it throws an error code in and it no longer wants to work properly. This happened actually last year to Rudy. He had a diesel heater. It threw an error code in the middle of the night and he stopped getting heat. And the temperature outside was in the 20s. Now that's not overly cold, but it was 20 with a 20-mile-an-hour wind chill blowing against his tent. He was quite cold. So I like inspecting these to make sure this works. Now I turned this on already earlier, and I know that this thing is working properly as it should. And it's going to need to, because I'm going to be using this here in another week or so on my next adventure. All right, one of the biggest items that I use all the time, whether it's a day trip, a multi-day trip, a long trip, is my air up system. And as you guys know, or if you haven't, last year my old system died when I needed it most. And it wasn't because I wasn't taking care of it. It was actually a fault with the microchip that's in here that helps the motherboard that processes everything. But it went bad and left it to where I had to drive about 30 miles on like 14 psi to the nearest fuel station to air up my tires. But one of the biggest things you have to do is just check visually on your system to make sure it's running, and then you can also test it out. Now, if you're using this all the time, you're generally going to know if something is starting to go wrong with your system when you are using it. So it's not necessarily the biggest thing to check it while it's at home, because typically it's normally working. But visually inspecting it when you are at home is huge on making sure that it is working properly. So one of the things I do, and I do this after every single trip that I go on, is I wipe this thing down. When I get home, I take it out. When I am doing the cleanup on the vehicles and on my gear, I wipe this down and clean it up, because dirt, mud, and grime hide issues. So once it's cleared away, issues can be revealed. And also, if it's cleared away, issues that then arise are easier to find than not knowing. So one of the things I do is I make sure it's clean. I like to ensure that it is completely clean and that visually I don't see any kind of leakage from any parts of the motor, anything of that nature. Now, when my last system went bad, smoke billowed out from under this cap. Because on the Morphlate system, which this is what it is, the motherboard is right underneath this black cap here, and if it starts to smoke and go bad, you're going to smell it, and it's going to smell like burning electrical and rubber. So you're going to know that when it's running. But I like to inspect the outside, making sure everything works. If I flip it around, all the connections are right here. Now, on the newer systems, you have this little button which lets all the air out of the system that is remaining within it. So I like to check and listen to make sure that that button's actually working. I can actually hear it engaging on the other side. Generally, you should be letting the air out of your system after you air up your tires anyways. But if you didn't and you press that button when you're checking it, you're definitely going to find out. Next, I'm going to check the steel braided hose that is the connection point for your air. So I'm going to check this connection point here, make sure that it moves, everything looks okay on the inside, and then I'm just going to check the hose and make sure there's no kink in the hose, that there's no parts of the braid that seems to be fraying or coming undone. The old hose wasn't a steel line, so now it's a steel line. It's a lot stronger. The old hose, it would start to fray because it was more of just a cloth lining that went over it. Next, I'm going to check your connectors, guys. These are highly important. These are what connects to your battery, and if they are messed up, you're definitely going to know when you go to stick it on, and you don't want to short something out. So I like checking that the connectors work, these open and close properly, and then I just like to check the lines to make sure that they are still actually connected and nothing looks visually wrong with these connectors. And then after that, with this part, it's just testing it. Now, if you have a system that has a screen on it on the front, like I did with the diesel heater, check the buttons, make sure the buttons are working. It's not a bad idea to connect this to a battery or to your vehicle so that the digital display clicks on and you can check it. Because with those systems, most of the time, if the screen doesn't work, the system's not going to work. It's not like this one where all I do is I flip the switch and it kicks on and starts running. And then I have to visually monitor everything else. Those, you need the screen working to do so. I don't have that, so I can't show it to you. Next, with the system, your hoses themselves. Now, my system, as some of you guys know, is a 4-tire inflation system. It is highly, highly important that you check this stuff over to ensure it's working. Now, this gets checked, like I said, after every trip. I wipe off the hoses because if there's something wrong with the hoses, as I'm wiping it down, I am physically feeling the entire hose. You're going to feel that there's a hole. But one thing I like to check are these connection points because they do get a little stiff and they do fall in the dirt. They can get sand stuck in them. So I like to visually check those. I like to check the connection points where the hoses all connect to let the air flow through different parts of the hose. You're going to know if air is flowing out of these, and if they are loose, that's a problem. They shouldn't be. And then finally, if your hoses do this, some do not. Mine does come with an inflation valve. I like to click it on to make sure that the screen still works, as in the buttons work, the screen comes on, and I can turn it off. and I can change the units. If the screen doesn't come on, this does have a battery. It means I need to change the battery so that I can visually see the screen. Because for some people, they don't have a newer rig. They drive older rigs, which is great, but they don't have a tire sensor system within their Jeep's computer or their rig's computer that can tell them when the tires are at the point that they need to be. So they rely on this. If the screen goes dead, have some extra batteries handy if you know that that's constantly a problem. Otherwise, just check it to make sure that the batteries are good. And then guys, all you have to do if you really want to is test it. Otherwise, everything should be good to go for your next adventure. The next piece of gear that you may not use, and honestly, you may not really think about, but it should be checked out every so often, is your spare fuel. Now, some people have roto packs, some people have jerry cans like this, some people actually carry gas cans. It doesn't matter what it necessarily is. Normally you want something that is not going to spill and leak as best it can, but you should be checking these whether you use them or not, because as you guys know, gas likes to eat things. Now, though it's probably not going to eat this tank necessarily, it can eat the rubber seals that is on this and start to break them down, and then they'll start leaking. The other thing is, if you haven't used your gas can in a while, as in a few months, because you're on adventures and it's literally just an emergency and you know you'll never use it, put that gas into your rig and refill it. Because the ethanol that is in the newer gas today, over time, will start to go bad. And then that gas will start leaving deposits, and it gets really bad, not just for the tank, but it can be for when you need it. So a rule of thumb for me is every about 2 months, I dump these gas cans into the Jeep and I refill them so that there is fresh gas. Otherwise, if you want it to last longer, going with gas that is ethanol free, or something along those lines, or even 91 octane. Yes, it has ethanol in it, but because it's a higher octane level, it doesn't break down as bad. It still does, but not quite as bad as like E85 and stuff like that, or 85 octane. Just check that stuff, guys, and make sure you're rotating the gas, because you don't want old gas. Next thing I like to do with these, because I don't have roto packs, this is what I'm going off of, is I like to visually inspect the outside of the tank for rust. This actually has a little bit of surface rust. I've had this thing for about 3 years now, and it's lived on the outside of the Jeep. But I check it for rust, scratches, dents within this thing, and also visually inspecting the seam that runs along this, because you're going to know if the seam has gone bad or if one of the welds for the seams has deteriorated. You're going to smell and see where the gas has been pooling up in this thing. With these cans, generally, you normally either have them sitting upright, or like my setup, they sit like this on their side. One of the goals with these cans is when you're filling them, guys, you don't fill it all the way to the top and brim it, because that will start to leak and eat away at this thing. You want to fill it to where it stops roughly like around this spot here, so that the fumes, the expansion of the fuel inside here has room to move, it can slosh around, and then when you open this, it doesn't blow up in your face necessarily. Next, I like to check is the little locking pin that is to help lock this cap in place. You don't want this pin bent, because then you won't get it out. You want it to be working functionally to keep the cap locked in place. I pull it out, and then I like to check the tank. You can take a flashlight, shine it in here, make sure that there isn't a bunch of deposits forming at the bottom of your tank. If there is, you might want to get a solution to clean this thing out. And I specifically say a solution for cleaning gas. You don't want to put like soap and water in here, because then you need to ensure that all of it gets out completely and it's completely dry before you can put fuel back in this thing. Next, kind of like the diesel heater, the rubber seal on these things. They are notorious for going bad. Generally, when you buy a gas tank like this, they come with some spare rubber seals. I keep them as a spare part in the Jeep, but these rubber seals can start to go bad, and then your fuel will start to leak out. But once again, if it's starting to go gray, if there's a bunch of grime around it, clean it off. If it's going gray, you're seeing cracks, It's a sign the rubber seal needs to be replaced. It's no longer going to be functioning as it should, and it needs to be, changed out. And these things do go bad, guys. I've changed this one out already. I did it last year because when I checked all my gear, the rubber seal after 2 years had started to crack and was going bad, so I changed it out. This is a new rubber seal that survived all last year, so I probably have about another year before I need to replace it again. And then just check the latch mechanism itself. Make sure that this is latching and has a good seal. It's not just super loosey-goosey and can come apart super easy. Just check that. And then do it for all your tanks. If it's diesel, a water tank, fuel tank, just like this one, you need to inspect them, especially if you're using it for water, because the water will start to rust these things out a little bit quicker, because though they're coated on the inside, water does have that tendency to not like metal very well. So just check these things. It's all the same process, and you're looking for the exact same things. With the water, though, you're probably not looking for little deposits at the bottom of the tank, but you need to check that whether it's for your diesel or for this. Some of the other things. Now, I have went over these in how it works videos in the past, guys, but just checking your recovery gear, whether it is your tree strap, your soft shackles, your hard shackles, any type of recovery gear you have, check it. Run it through your fingers. Look for any tears within the fibers if they are, a synthetic line or a tree strap. You don't want those things to fail when you need them the most. So just going through, checking them, making sure that, like these live in the box on the outside of the Jeep. These now live in a waterproof bag because before the box stopped being super waterproof and they used to get wet and then they'd start smelling moldy. I had to dry them out excessively and stick them in a waterproof bag. So make sure that they're not constantly wet smelling and ensure that they're just in good use, guys. Recovery gear can last a long time if it's well taken care of, but you have to be able to check that stuff to make sure, and it's the same across all your recovery gear. Now, when it comes to your winch, that'll be something completely different that I will discuss in a different video, but it's kind of the same thing. You need to pull out that line, you need to check it. I will go through that with you guys in a different video. But it is a piece of recovery gear and you need to make sure that it is functional as well. But just check your gear, your runner boards, all those things to ensure that they are going to be working optimal for if you ever need them or if you come across somebody else that needs your help. Okay, the next items of business. They are a piece of gear, whether you think they are or not, but you should check them, is your spare parts. Because you don't know, you never know when, if on the trail, whether you, somebody in your convoy, or you come across somebody that needs a spare part and you have the ability to help them or you have the ability to fix your rig. Most people don't realize that though you carry spare parts, it's great. If you need that spare part, you use it. Most people don't then replace the part. They forget to buy that next part because it's the middle of their adventure, and by the time they're done, they're just so happy that everything is working and they forget. But having things like a spare serpentine belt with you can come a long way, especially with higher mileage vehicles. Those things eventually break, wear down, they don't work properly, and then you're screwed if you don't have one with you. It took me watching Matt from Ozark Overland Adventures when his Gladiator serpentine belt went bye-bye and his Gladiator started to overheat and he didn't have a spare. That made me instantly go get a spare. So thanks, Matt. But having a spare thing, and then checking your spare nuts, bolts, items like that you are carrying with you. You want to ensure that you have the spares available and ready, that you're not missing any spares, and that the spares you have are in good shape. Now, nuts and bolts, things like that don't tend to go bad over time, but things like a serpentine belt, if you've had a spare serpentine belt for years, and depending on where it's been located, you might want to check it for cracks and things like that, because these can go bad just sitting around and not in the proper environment. So you need to check those things. Check your nuts and bolts that you have and make sure that depending on where they're stashed, they're not rusting. Because if you have a Gladiator or a truck or something and the bed isn't encapsulated and you keep these things in a storage box back there, dirt, grime, water, things like that can possibly get in there and things can start to rust. So you just need to check your recovery gear. But it is an overlooked item that most people never check, don't think of twice. They just ensure that they have some and that's it, or they don't have any whatsoever. But if you do, check them out. It's not hard. It's a quick look, go, woo, good, put them back where they go. And then you are all set. So if there is an emergency, something goes wrong, you have it. One of the things I now carry also, which I don't have available because I'm still waiting for it to come in, is spare wheel speed sensors. Yeah, it only took one trip and waiting forever for a new part. I have a spare front and a spare rear wheel speed sensor. They're just not here yet because, you know, I ordered them 5 weeks ago. They're still not here. This is going to seem silly to some people, but a piece of gear that most people that are going out for multi-day trips carry with them is a rear tire or an exterior carrier for a trash bag. This is what sits on my spare tire on the back of the Jeep. Check that this is in decent shape. Don't get me wrong, these things tend to deteriorate, and over time they can get really, really bad and break down. It happens, especially if it sits on the outside. It is taking all the battering in the world and all the weather elements. But things to check for are your plastic clips, guys. Make sure they're not cracked, broke. Check the part that inserts into the clips. Make sure it has both the ears, everything's there. And then just kind of check your bag for holes. Keep it clean. I just like checking the inside for holes, things like that, so that when you're putting trash in there, hopefully you're putting it in a trash bag. But if you're not, you know, you're putting trash in there, make sure that it's not just falling out as you're driving. Especially if you're like me, you normally get to campsites and there's trash, glass, cans, metal all over. You start picking that up. You want to make sure that it's not just ripping your bag and things like that. But one thing you don't want is for this to just break and fly off while you're on the trail or on the freeway, and all your trash is now scattered everywhere and you're doing what you were trying to prevent. So just one thing to look at and check, because most people, some of them have this as a permanent fixture to their rig, and they don't really think about it too much because it's not something they take on and off all the time. For me, I check it every time I take it off from an adventure because it doesn't permanently live on the back of my rig. But just one of those things to keep in mind, that though it probably is going to hold up for a good long while, these do tend to deteriorate and they do need replacing. So it does happen, but keep that in mind. Okay guys, one of the bigger things that I probably should have started with, but I didn't, so we're here now, is your tools. Most people go on an adventure, whether it's a day, multi-day, expedition style trip, they take tools. Something goes wrong, you use those tools and then they put them back. Make sure you're checking your tools. One thing you don't want is to be losing tools out on the trail, because some people, like this is one of the tool bags that I take besides this, is a bag full of tools that are all just kind of in there. They all just kind of fall around, they move around, but they're in there. And when I go in there to find things, I have to go digging, looking for the tool that I need. That's just a lot of typical wrenches and things like that in that bag. But if I use them, I need to make sure they're all back in there. And sometimes you just kind of, in the moment of fixing things and putting things away, you may not make it into the bag, or you may have set it somewhere else and you don't remember. So check your tools, make sure that you have, one, all of them, and two, they're in working order. They're not worn out, they don't look rusty, they're not going to break. And then if you have a tool box, tool chest, a tool case like this, like I have, ensure you have all your sockets, that your sockets are in decent shape, they're not grimy, they're not rusting away. Make sure your socket or your ratchets work, your wrenches are there, and make sure your screwdrivers aren't worn out and things like that. You just want to check your gear, especially your tools, because if something goes wrong, besides having spare parts, you need tools to fix the issue, to put the spare part on or take the old part off. And if your tools aren't in decent shape and they're really, really old and they're not working properly anymore, because tools do wear out over time, they're going to do you no good. It's not helpful if you're missing tools or if they're no longer working properly, because now your life, yes, you have a tool, but it's going to make your life just as hard. So just check to make sure your tools are in adequate shape to be used on your adventures, guys. And like I said, that they're all there. Moving on to kind of the at camp side of things. We've been checking all the gear, that some of which you use at camp, some of which lives within your rig and you use for your rig. Now let's talk about the gear that you will use at camp 90% of the time. Now, most people have gone to using electric, whether it's a 12-volt system, a power station, something of that nature. If you are using that, make sure your fuses are good, make sure your connectors are good, make sure those are all working properly. If it's a power station, make sure it's clean, dust it out, ensure that it's charging properly, and your apps and things like that are working adequately so you can monitor it, and that those are all working. Most of the time, those aren't going to have too much of an issue, but if you're not cleaning it, dust, especially a power station, can really get in those areas, and if you're not blowing it out, it can affect the way that it cools itself and keeps itself running. So just keep that in mind. But if you are still using propane, whether it's a big tank like this, the little baby tank, which I have sitting right over there, if it is one of those things, you need to check that your little nozzle, your regulator on the top of the tank is still good. These things normally last, I think it's like 10 years, and then they're supposedly supposed to be replaced. Most places won't refill them if they seem to be old, but just check it. Make sure it's not rusting, deteriorating, that you can open and close it and it's actually closing and not leaking. Smell for fuel, or smell for propane. And then just check the tank itself. These tanks are notorious for getting rusty, scratched, and then things just start to go wrong, especially at the bottom. Just check them out to see how they're doing and that they're still adequately working. With the smaller tank, which I have sitting over there, I keep forgetting it's over there, you just need to check it, make sure it's good, and then check the hose that connects to this. It's like any other hose. Check for cracks, the rubber being too dry, and make sure that the cap or the connector will connect onto this, onto your stove, whatever it is it's connecting to. Make sure that they are working properly. That's all I'm going to say on propane tanks. Then your kitchen gear, your camping cookware, things like that. I forgot that was there. Camping cookware like this, check it. Make sure that it, is clean, that it is still going to work properly, that there's not, rust particles, metal flaking happening, things of that nature. If you're using cast iron, make sure it's clean to the best of its ability. Make sure that you're not eating chunks of cast iron as it's breaking apart and coming off. But you just need to check those things. If you have a bunch of pots, make sure they work, they're clean. You don't want to be eating off of really dirty cookware, guys, while you're at camp. And it kind of goes the same for your knives. Check to make sure your knives are all sharp, your silverware's clean, things of that nature. It isn't overly difficult to check those things. It's one of those things that most people overlook because they clean it at camp to a degree. They put it back in there, they get home. If you're like me, you have a kitchen set up in the back of your Jeep. They don't really come back out until you need them next. And I try to keep these clean as best I can when I come home from a trip. Now, one of my new things that I've got this year, and I have not used it yet, which I'm excited to use, but I know a lot of people do have them, is some kind of scuttle. This is a Timbo Tusk. It's not a sponsor of the channel. It was a birthday gift. But I do now have a scuttle. Scuttles are a little bit different when it comes to using them. They are a cookware. You have to clean them, make sure that they're kind of oiled, and there's a special way to clean these. It's normally just with water going across it to clean it off. But you just want to make sure that this is clean. This isn't truly rusting. If it's rusting, you need to oil it, do some work to it to help keep it clean. These scuttles, whether it's Timbo Tusk or some other form of kitchen scuttle for camp, typically stay pretty well clean. They don't normally have too many problems. Check where the propane connection is supposed to go. Check the legs, the stands, things of that nature. And just check your kitchen gear, guys. Make sure, like I said, clean, operational, and is stored back where it goes. Finally, guys, for the camp aspect of things, your tent, your sleeping gear, things of that nature. Check them out. Whether it is a ground tent, a rooftop tent, open them up when you're at home, clean them out, check them out, make sure the fabrics are good, there's no holes anywhere. Make sure that if your tent has poles, that the poles are still in good shape, nothing needs fixing. Make sure that everything is just going to be ready for your next outing. I like to, as you guys know, with my ground tents, I like to, when I get home, put them up, I like to spray them down. I like to clean the inside out because most of the time it gets really dirty on the inside. I like to make sure that these things are clean and optimal, and during that time, I can check for holes, things of that. And if it's leaking after I spray it off, I know I need to re-waterproof the thing. So just check your tent, check your sleeping mat that you may sleep on, your clothing, your covers that you use, your pillows, things like that. All the stuff that makes those little creature comforts at camp, especially when you're sleeping at night, make sure they're working. It's a big, huge thing, because some people, they will forget after a trip that, hey, something was wrong with the tent or something needed to be fixed, and they won't remember till they get back out on their next trip, and then you pop it all up, whether it's rooftop tent, ground tent, and then you're like, yeah, I forgot that was messed up. I should have fixed that. Oh, well, it's going to have to wait till I get home, and then you're going to forget again. So just go through, check your stuff. Like my big, huge Gazelle tent that's on the other side of the camera that this sits on top of, that one I check all the time when we get home, because when I use it, it's with me and my dad. So there's 2 people using that tent. It is twice as big. We like to make sure that it is optimally working, because you don't want things to go wrong at the last second. Especially after our last trip we used it on in Idaho, the final night when the wind ripped the rain fly off of it. It ripped the rain fly off of it. Nothing broke, thankfully, but we had to check it all over because it was some very strong winds, and we really thought it broke some of the poles, but it didn't, thankfully. But we wouldn't have known that until we checked it, because trying to get out of that wind, we literally just crammed it all into the bag, said we'll check it later, and we did. So just make sure that your tents, guys, your stuff at camp is working. Now, when it comes to rooftop tents, make sure that the bolts are still holding the tent to your roof rack or its connection points to your rig. Ensure that those are still tight. They haven't rattled loose. There's no issues. And make sure your roof rack is still tight, not having issues, not coming off. Rudy, I'm sorry, did I say that out loud? You don't want an incident where on the trail you hear on the radio, holy crap, my roof rack is coming off my Jeep or off my rig, or my tent's falling off. It has happened. I have seen it. I have seen it through other videos. These things have happened. Just check the bolts, guys. It takes you a couple seconds. Make sure they're still tight, because you don't want that to happen, whether it's on the trail, on the highway, getting to and from where you want to go. Just make sure that it is there, because a lot of people, at least here in Colorado, love to live with their rooftop tent still on their rig 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round. Whether they use it or not, I doubt they're really checking the bolts and connections on it all the time, so you just don't want those to go bad, guys, or to come loose and things go catastrophically wrong. So check your camping gear, make sure it all works correctly. And that's pretty much it, guys. Some other little things to check for that I cannot show you, mostly because I'm either don't have access to it at the moment, or it's not on the Jeep, is things like your awning on your rig, whether it's 360, 270, pull-out awning. Check the awning, make sure that things aren't going wrong with it. Make sure that if the wind was really bad and it broke something, that you remember to replace those parts. But check the fabric. It's kind of like checking a tent. Make sure that it's still optimal, it's working, and it's still secured to your rig. Something else to check is your totes. Whether it's a storage case, totes, things like that, stuff that you use to carry items in your rig, on top of your rig, in the back of your rig. Make sure they're still working. Make sure that if they're supposed to be dust and waterproof, that they're still dust and waterproof and they're not having issues. The latches still work. Things aren't broke. And also check your ratchet straps. Make sure that there's no rips in them, that the hooks are still working, the ratchet part is working itself and it's not just coming undone or not tightening anymore. Check those things out to ensure that they are optimally working, because you'll always need them. I've ran into several times on the trail where whether I needed them, somebody else needed them to keep something strapped because something broke. They become highly important, and make sure that they are, load rated for what you need them to do. But that's it, guys. That is it for your gear and what you should be checking. Like I said, this wasn't about what gear should you have. It was about whether your gear works and how to check it. And we went through the gear that I have, that I use on every single trip, and we checked it to make sure that it's working. I showed you the points of interest that you should be looking at on your stuff. Now, in our next video that I'll do, we will cover the things on your rig itself, whether it's a Jeep, Toyota, doesn't matter. Most of these things, unless it's a really, really old rig, no wheel speed sensors, things you should be checking on your rig after and before you go out on an adventure to ensure that it is working properly, guys. You don't want that issue, but that's a whole nother video. But that is it for this video. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, guys. You guys are what makes this channel happen, and it helps me out immensely. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. In the description below, you will find a link to Linktree. What's in the Linktree? Everything you just saw. Most of it is in there as a link for you in a convenient spot. You can click it, it'll take you to that site. You can look into it. Or guys, it's called Google and the internet if you were looking into something. Search it. It's not hard. But there is a link in the description for that. Otherwise, guys, thank you all so much for joining me. And next time you're here, we will be talking about the Jeep and things you should be looking for. Till then, guys, take care.